Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf kaftet of Masechet Chulin. We are near the bottom of Kafchet Amud Bet. Let me share my screen and we will get started. Um, Yesterday we saw the following debate. Rav said that half is considered the majority, and Rav Kahana said half is not considered the majority, meaning, do you round up or effectively treat half as the whole thing? Or do you need to actually have a majority in order to say that you have that it's like you have the whole thing, and that potentially can have lots of applications. And so we've asked two questions to challenge Rav, saying, "Hey, doesn't our Mishnah's reference to half, if you do half of one of the pipes of one of the simanim for a bird, where you only need to do one pipe, that indicates that it's puzzle. Doesn't that indicate that it was that half is not considered like a majority because a majority would be kosher? And so doesn't the fact that it's invalid if you do only exactly half indicate that Rob is wrong?" And we answered no. That's actually only rabbinically that it would be prohibited according to Rob. And then we said, well, what about the case of an oven that is tameh and is made out of pottery, and you have to break it into half, and you break it into two pieces that are exactly the same size. And we said we cited a Mishnah, a Brisa, excuse me, Brisa that says that if they're roughly the same size, because we cannot be sure that it's exactly half, that it is considered that both halves remain tameh, and implying that if you knew that it was exactly half, it would be considered broken, and something is broken only if you don't have a majority. And so, as a result, doesn't that show that 50% is not the majority? Well, that case was different because you had two exact halves. And so, as a result, when you say that one is the majority, it implies that the other is automatically the minority. But when you have two exact halves, you can't make that statement. And so, as a result, we answered that Rav's statement is limited to situations where you don't have that issue, where it's not 50-50 with respect to one item. And so as a result, we come to the third challenge and we say, Tashma, last line, only abbreviation on the line. Tashma, come and learn. Here's another brisa that's going to refute what Rav said. Shachat chatzi
You can't
garger.
have both of them. If they're both equally half, you can't have two majorities, right? Is that what he's saying?
That's exactly right. That's why in the case of the oven split into two pieces, that we are going to not treat 50% as the majority in that case, but in general he would treat 50% as the majority. So that's again that's the Rav's updated position, or how we're understanding Rav's updated position based on the second challenge. So now we come to the third challenge and we say shachat chetzi gargeres v'shahaba. If you we saw this price a little earlier, if you cut the first half of the trachea and then you pause. Now remember, when you cut half the trachea, as long as you don't cut a majority of the trachea, we treat that as if there is as not being a a treifa. For it to be a treifa, you have to the more than half of the trachea needs to be cut, and so as a result, the animal's not a treifa, and therefore, if you wait, as we turn to kaf teram and aleph, kadesh shchita acheres, if you wait the amount of time to do another shechita, so you've now violated, if this was all considered one shechita, you would have violated shehiyah, and therefore the shechita would not be valid. However, because what ugmara, and now you finished the shchita. Shchita kshera, the slaughtering is kosher. Why is it kosher? Because we can treat the animal post the first half cut of the trachea as being a non-treifa animal. And now you do a whole new shchita by completing the shchita of the trachea. And that shchita is kosher because the animal um, was not a treifa. And so it's a kosher animal and everything is fine. And therefore it's a kosher shchita, as Rashi says. Ugmara, kasalka daitich. I'm sorry. And we think at the moment, bebehemukai, that we're talking about a larger animal, debai rov shnayim, where you need to be cutting a majority of the two pipes. And so now you're not actually cutting a majority of the two pipes. Umay Gemara l'shchita. And what do we mean by Gemara? We mean that you finished the entire shchita. So Ve'i Amrad Mechzal Mechza, back into the Gemara.
Why isn't
Secondly,
he over Shahia? Isn't he violate the Shahia?
because the shehiyah is only if you pause in the middle of the shchita after you have done enough of the shchita to make the animal a treifa. If you have not, that's what this Bryce is teaching us. This Bryce is teaching us that if in fact you cut the treifa first and you do shehiyah on the treifa before you've cut a majority of the treifa, then that is not going to be a problematic shehiyah because we can view the world as if you were not the cause of the first half of this cutting of the trachea. We could pretend that really that's what happened in the world. The animal came across a thorn and it cut its trachea in this way. And so as a result, what you do afterwards, after the first half of the trachea has been cut, constitutes a valid shchita because your cut constituted the majority of the trachea and you cut all of the esophagus. And so as a result, it's going to be a valid cut. But now we're going to ask the question to Rav, right? Again, remember, Rav's the one who says that half is considered the majority. But if you say that half exactly is like the rove is cut, itarfala, it should be a treifa now because you've cut half of the trachea and half is considered like the majority. And so as a result, the half that's been cut should be considered as if you've created a treifa. So the Gemara answers, Mi svarat bivehema. You thought we were talking about a large animal, and that when we said Gemara, we meant you were completing the shchita of both pipes. No, lo ba'of. We're talking about a bird. Mima nafshach. And if we're talking about a bird, we win no matter what. Because imekta mekta karov. If in fact 50-50 is like the majority, well, ha'avid le'ruba, then his initial slaughter of the first half of the trachea constitutes rove of the trachea, and therefore it is a valid slaughter. The machza ain't a karov, and if 50-50 is not like a rove, well then lo avid below klum, he hasn't done anything because the animal doesn't become a treifa because you haven't considered you haven't cut rove of the trachea, and so as a result, the completion of the shchita is a valid shchita, and so that could be the case in that brisa, and so as a result, we've again supported Rav's conclusion. Now we're going to
Why
have
is the animal not a treifa?
because you've only cut 50% and 50% um, uh, 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 because we're not talking about a large animal. And so as a result, either if you
Mm.
agree with Rav, you've cut a majority of the of the animal of the bird's trachea, and therefore it's a valid shchita. And if you disagree with Rav, well then you haven't cut more than a majority of the treifa, more than a majority of the trachea, and so the animal's not a treifa. And so now when you cut a little bit more, that constitutes a valid shchita. So no matter what, this all works both according to Rav and according to Rav Kahana.
But if it was a large animal, it would be a treifa.
Well, but a large animal, then it would be problematic to Rav if that brisa was talking about a large animal. And
Because
so now we're going to get
what? Now, why would it be a treifa with a large animal?
because according to Rav, if you cut half of the trachea, that's considered the majority of the trachea. And so as a result, the majority of the trachea is cut. So now it's a treifa.
Oh,
So
it's
as
a
a result,
treifa.
if you wait in the
Right.
middle of that situation, it'd be a real problem.
Right.
Okay, so now we come to the final challenge from the following brisa. This also brisa I think we've seen before. Yeah, we saw it back on Kaf Chet Amud Aleph. So Tashma Hare Shahaya Chatzi Kana Pugum. You have half of the trachea and it's blemished. And Rashi explains Chatzi Kana Pugum Be'of. We're talking about a bird. Lav Kol Shehu Gemaro. And now you add a little bit more and you finish the shchita. Shchita so kshera. It is a kosher shchita. The amra mektal mektam kerov. But one second, if you say like Rav and that 50-50 is half, it is considered the majority. Treifa havya. Well, you cut, yeah, it's got a blemish on half of its trachea. Half is like the majority. A blemish on the majority of the trachea constitutes a treifa. So why isn't this animal a treifa? So amarava shiny le'inyan treifa de be'inan rov hanira le'inayim. No, I'm going to explain Rav and tell you the following. Really, Rav says that when it comes to a treifa, you need a rove that is visible. As Rashi tells us, one, two, three, four, 5 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. Rov hanira le'inayim, kolomar, rov gamor shehu nikar. You need a real majority that is clear to the naked eye that you can tell it's a majority. So, Amar le Abaye, Abaye says that does not work as an answer. Velo kol who. 1 second, we have a kal v'chomer. Ma'uma treifa dibimashu mitarfa. When it comes to the concept of treifa, excuse me, please hold on just a second. Okay, when it comes to to the topic of treifa, where demashu mitarfa, that even a little bit in certain circumstances, even a small hole can constitute a treifa, namely a small hole on the esophagus. Well, heka de'inan ruba be'inan rov hanira leinayim. But when you need the majority, you need a visible majority. So shchita da deika ruba lo miskashra. But when it comes to slaughtering, where there's never validity unless you slaughter the majority, lo kol shekain de be'inan rov hanir leinayim. Well, then you should certainly require that you cut enough so that it's visible that there's a majority. So as a result, we reject our understanding of Rav and our machlokus between Rav and Rav Kahana is not what we thought, but rather Ella de Kule Alma Mechza al Mechza Aina Karo. Really, exactly 50-50 is not like the majority. The Chi Itmer de Rav. And where did Rav make his statement? Uda Rav Kahana, and Rav Kahana had his argument. Le'inyan Pesach Itmar. It was said with respect to the holiday of Pesach, namely Harei Shehayu Yisrael Mechza Tahorim Mechza Tameim. When you have 50% exactly of the Jewish people being Tameh and 50% being Tahor. Now we know that when it comes to the Karban Pesach, if an individual is tameh, they don't bring the Karban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, but rather they wait until the 14th of Iyar. And so as a result, namely Pesach Sheni. And so that's what happens for an individual. But we also know that if the entire community is tameh, well, then the entire community can bring the Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. They don't need to wait, as we will see the citation for that in just a moment. So in this case, where it's exactly half, what do we do? Rav Amar Mechza al Mechza Karov. Rav says that the 50-50 that is Tameh is treated like the majority. The Rav Kahana Amar. And so as a result, Rashi tells us Mechza al Mechza Karov, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. Mechza al Mechza Karov. Utahorim osin la'atzman betara. So as a result, those who are tahor will make their own groups and perform the Pesach sacrifice in purity. Utamein osin la'atzman betuma. And those who are tamei will do their own korban Pesach in tuma. V'lo midchu lepesach sheni ki yechidin. And they will not get pushed off to Pesach Sheni the way an individual would. Okay, the Rav Kahana Amar and back into the Gemara. We're now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines up in the narrow lines of the Gemara on Kaf Amud Aleph. Last words on the line, last 2 words on the line. The Rav Kahana Amar Metzal Metza Eino Kirov. That situation is not like a majority. And Rashi tells us, the next Rashi, Eino Kirov, V'nidchin hatameim l'sheni. And so as a result, those who are tamei, the 50% exactly of the Jewish people that are tamei, end up waiting until Pesach Sheni. V'hasa my time of the Rav. Well, what's the reasoning of Rav? Meaning, why does he say that exactly 50-50 constitutes a majority in that situation? So we get the Gemara's answer, Diksiv. And this is the Gemara's answer also to explain why, if you had a total majority, if you had a clear majority, and why even if you had a majority of one, even Rav Kahana would agree that everybody waits until that nobody waits until Pesach Sheni, because the Torah says, and this is somewhat of a Daf Yomi coincidence because this is not this week's parsha, but it's next week's parsha. Although if you're in Israel, it's this week's parsha. In Perek Tez Pasuk Yud and Yud Aleph, it says Ish, Ish ki yet tamei lenefesh. Actually, I guess it's pasuk Yud is the key pasuk. Ki yet tamei lenefesh, and the pasuk says, "Oh, b'derech rukha lachem, oladorosechem v'asa pesach laHashem." So that the idea is that that's going to be in the second month. That's what the next pasuk comes in pasuk Yud Aleph. It tells us that it's in the second month on the 14th day. That's when you make it. What do we learn from this? Why does it say ish nidcha ve'ein sibor nidchen? An individual person gets pushed off, but the community does not get pushed off, as Rashi tells us. Ish ki yed tamei. Yidche, this is now just a few 2 lines down from where the last Rashi that we did ended. So, Diksiv ish ki yed tamei, Yidche l'sheni, that they will get pushed off to the Pesach Sheni. Upalga nehi deruba lo mikri, and according to now, while it's true that exactly half is not called a majority, mihu miklal yechidin nafkilahu, they also certainly are not considered an individual, the lo midchu, and so as a result, they do not get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. And so that is the explanation, and so there we have it. Okay. So
they're sitting on the fence. They're not a majority. They're not an individual.
Correct. Okay, so our Mishnah concluded that the slaughtering of one pipe is sufficient for a bird, but the Mishnah had already mentioned that at the start. So the Gemara asks, Rov echad ba'of, Tanina chada zimna, Rubo shel echad kamohu. We already learned that Rov of one pipe is sufficient. So why did we repeat that? So Amar of Hoshaya, Chada b'chulin v'chada b'kodshim. That actually there are 2 separate topics in our Mishnah, even though it's not clear from our Mishnah's text that that's the case. One refers to a chulin bird, and one refers to a bird that you wanted to use as a sacrifice. Utsricha, and you need to say both of them. Di'i ashma'in and chulin, because if we were just talking about chulin, Hasamu desagi lahoi baruba. Maybe that's the situation where rove is sufficient. Mishum delav l'damu tzarch. You don't need any blood. It's not as if there is a requirement to apply blood somewhere when you are shechting a bird to eat. Aval kodshim, but when it comes to a sacrifice, diladam hutzarech, where you're going to need to put the blood on the altar, ema lo tiske le beruba. Maybe it's not enough to cut the majority. Ad kule, you need to cut the entire pipes, so entire one pipe at least. Ve'iash me'inan kodshim, and then if you had only told me about Kudshim, that Kudshim was where you could do a majority of one pipe. Mishum diladamu tzarch. Maybe you need the majority because of the need for the blood. Aval chulin, but when it comes to a chulin, diladam lo tzarech, where you don't need the blood, ema bepalga sagile. Maybe exactly half is sufficient. Kamash malan. So that's why you need to maybe that's why we need to teach both of these because as a result, we learn that we need more than half with respect to chulin and only more than half with respect to kudshim. Okay,
Right.
so
But both of them are more than half.
yes, correct. But we need to learn about both of them. We need to teach this lesson about both topics because if we only taught it about one topic, we would think something different about the other topic. So that's why we had to repeat the law because one time it was telling us the law for chulin and one time it was telling us the law for kudshim. So hey b'chulin v'hey b'kudshim. So which of the references in our Mishnah is to the chulin case and which of the references is to the Kudshim case. And you may be wondering, hey, well, why would I care about that at all? Well, the next Mishnah is effectively a continuation of our Mishnah. And we will see that the next Mishnah has a law. And so if we say that the end of our Mishnah is dealing with Kudshim, then the law in the next Mishnah is limited to Kudshim. If, on the other hand, the end of our Mishnah is dealing with chulin, well, then the next Mishnah would also be dealing with chulin. Now, we are going to offer 5 different explanations, 5 different answers, and 5 different reasons for which reference, the first or the second, is to the chulin and which is to kudshim. All 5 actually agree. They all agree that when it comes to the first references, it's chulin, and when it comes to the second reference, it's kudshim. What they disagree about is what's the reason? Why do they say that that's the case? So Amar Rav Kahana offers the first reason. Mistabra Reisha b'chulin v'seifa b'kudshim. It makes sense to say that the first one is talking about chulin and the second is talking about kudshim. Mimai, why? The katani hashochet, because the opening of our Mishnah refers to shchita. And if you were going to tell me that the first part of our Mishnah is talking about sanctified birds, hamolek mi baile, we need to refer to malika because that's the process of slaughtering a bird in the Beis Hamikdash. 1 second though, elamai seifa b'kachim. Fine, so you're telling me that the end of the Mishnah is talking about kachim, but shchita so kshera, it says the word shchita there too. So malika so kshera mi baile. It should have said that its malika is kosher. And so the Gemara says no. On behalf of Rav Kahana, the answer is halo kasha. That is not in fact difficult. I did disalach mi behema because the last case of our Mishnah is talking about a larger animal. So Tananami Shchita so Kshera. That's why, even though it refers to both the bird and the animal, and even though it's referring to Kudshim, that's why we're talking about Shchita. Ela Resha, but in the Resha, Mikti, let's take a look. Al Ofkoi, the first thing animal that's referenced is a bird. So Isachadaita Bekudshim, Hamolek mi Baile. And so as a result, you're right that technically maybe it should also say shchita at the end. It should also say malika. It should say malika at the end. But because it's talking about both birds and animals, and the most recently discussed creature is an animal, and therefore, and not a bird. So that's why it talks about shchita, and therefore we can say that the beginning is chulin and the end is kudshim. And that is answer number one. Answer number two, Rav Shimi
But
Bar.
do we know, does it refer to a bird or an animal or both?
The end refers to both, but it talks about shchita because it had just talked about an animal. So even though when it comes to the bird, and it says that a majority of one is sufficient, it's referring to malika. But because it also talked about an animal, it goes back to the language of shchita. So Rav Shimi Bar Ashi Amar, Rav Shimi Bar Ashi says the following. Again, Reisha B'chulin Mihacha. I'll tell you that the beginning of our Mishnah is chulin because of the following. The Ketani, Echad Ba'of. What did we say? We said that one is sufficient for a bird. And if you were to tell me that we're talking about birds and about sacrifices, ha'ika olas ha'of, there is a situation where one is not sufficient for a bird. Because the olas ha'of, the ola offering, the bird ola offering, deboy shnei simanim, you have to cut both of them. And so as a result, that's why the beginning must be chulin, and so the end is going to be kudshim. Elamai, 1 second though, you're going to tell me that the end is kudshim, seifet b'kudshim, rov echad ba'of. It says rov echad for a bird. Isn't that ha ika olas ha'of? What about your comment about there being bird ola offerings, the boy shnei simanim? So doesn't the end of the Mishnah suffer the same problem of the Resha of the Mishnah? No, it's different because in the Resha we said echad. We said echad ba'of, meaning it's just one. But here, what does rov echad? My rov echad, rov kol echad be'echad. So therefore, that it's a majority of each one. Ubedinhu delays ne rov shnayim. Now, really, the Mishnah should have taught us that you need the majority of both. But kevan deika chatas. However, it can't quite use that language because if it had said rov shnayim, that would not be accurate for a bird chatas offering. Desagile bechad simon. That's a bird chatas offering. You only have to cut one of the pipes. And so as a result, we use mishum haki lo psikale. So as a result, we didn't make a clear distinction. And that's and so as a result, the language of rov echad is less clear because it could mean rov kol echad ve'echad. And so as a result, we use rov echad, and that works fine to cover both the case of a chatas ha'of and olas ha'of.
With the ola, you need two simanim.
Correct, correct. And so as a result, we used a more ambiguous language that when it comes to the olas ha'of, it means rov kol echad ve'echad, and when it comes to the chatas ha'of, it means rov echad. And so as a result, that's why we didn't use the language of rov shnayim.
Oh, so rov kol echad ve'echad refers to two simanim?
Yes, rov kol echad ve'echad means a majority of each of the two.
Not each of the animals, but each of the two simanim.
Correct. Thank you for helping to clarify that. So, third answer, and again, all of our answers are going to come to the same conclusion. Rav Papa Amar Reisha B'chulin Mahacha. I'll tell you that the beginning is a chulin because of the following. The Ketani Rabbi Yehuda Amar. What did we say in the case of Rabbi Yehuda? Ad sheyishkot es havridin. You have to cut the vridin. Ufligi rabbanan alay. And the rabbis disagree with him and say you don't have to cut the vridin. Well, amra bishlama b'chulin. Now, if you say that this is talking about chulin shaker, everything works because we understand why the rabbis would disagree. Ela amra b'kachim. But if you tell me that we're talking about holy animals where you need the blood, amai b'ligi rabbanan alay. Why would the rabbis disagree? Hu atzmo l'damu tzarach. The whole point of slaughtering the animal is to get the blood so that you can sprinkle the blood on the altar. So they would not disagree with that. And so as a result, that's Rav Papa's justification. Answer number 4. Rav Ashi Amar Seifa B'Kodshim Mehacha. I'll tell you that the Resha has to be Chulin because the Seifa has to be Kodshim. And how do I know that the Seifa needs to be Kodshim? Dikatani, because look at what the next Mishnah is going to teach us. Hashochet shnei rashin ke'echad shchitaso kshera. If you slaughter two at the same time, it's the shchita is kosher. Now, what does that language imply? Hashoche implies diavad in that if you shecht it post facto, it's kosher. Lichatchila lo, but you shouldn't do it initially. Now, amrad bishlama bekadshim. If you tell me that that next mishnah, which would be a continuation of this mishnah, and therefore whatever we talk about last in our mishnah is going to also be referring to the next Mishnah, well, that works. Bishlam b'kachim. It works if you're talking about kachim, because hainu dilechatchila lo. That's why it would not be valid lechatchila. Mishum titani Rav Yosef, because we have a brisa that was taught by Rav Yosef. Now we're going to cite this brisa potentially two times today. Let's remember it well. So Tizbach, the Torah says it actually in Parak Yutet Pasuk Hey of Vayikra. It does not in fact say Tizbach. It says the sea v'chi tizbechu tizbechu zevach shlamim laHashem lirtzonchem tizbachuhu. Now we are going to break down that last word tizbachuhu into two parts: tizbach and hu, and we are, and that is because it is not written tough Zion bet chet vav hey vav, but rather tet Zion bet chet hey vav. And so, and the difference between tizbachuhu and tizbachehu is whether it's one person doing the slaughtering or two people doing the slaughtering. We will see exactly why that matters in a moment. So, but first we're breaking it down, and we say that the tizbachuhu begins with tizbach. You shall slaughter, meaning individually. What does that teach? Shelo yehe shnayim shochatim zevach echad. You cannot have two people slaughter one sacrifice. They can't do it together, either at the same time or one after the other. You can't have one person do the first half and the second person doing the second half. Tizbachuhu. So for a large animal, you can't, for example, have one person slaughter the trachea and the other person slaughter the esophagus.
Are we
Tizbachuhu.
talking about two people or two animals?
No, the first one is about two people. Two people. We're going to get to two animals in a moment.
That's not
Shelo
referring to.
yehe shnayim shochatim zevach echad. Right, that two people, two cannot slaughter one animal, one sacrifice.
Uh-huh.
So that's we're definitely talking about the people in the first case.
Okay.
And it's because we're saying tizbach is singular. So then it says tizbachuhu, and again, it's written without the vav, and so as a result, it's pronounced. We'll see in a moment tizbachehu. So, but the hu at the end of that tizbachu hu, it is singular. The vav at the end is a singular descriptor, singular object for the verb of tizbach. So shelo yehe echad shochet shnei zvachim. It teaches that one person should not slaughter two sacrifices at once, at least lechatchila. V'amar Rav Kahana tizbacheyu ksiv. And Rav Kahana explains that brisa by explaining that the whole point is that the pasuk writes the word as if it would be pronounced tizbachehu singular, meaning singular on the actor and singular on the creature, on the sacrifice. So Ella e amra b'chulin. But now, if you tell me that in fact the next Mishnah is talking about non-sacrificial animals, afilu lechatchila nami, it should be kosher even lechatchila if you'd slaughter two animals with one stroke, because there's no psukim that would say that it should be prohibited. So so that was answer number 4. Answer number 5 is offered by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish sava reisha b'chulim v'seifa b'kachim. He agrees with everybody. Da'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish ma'achar sheshaninu rubo shel achad kamo. Well, once we taught in the beginning of our Mishnah that a majority is like the whole thing. Lama sheninu rov echad ba'of v'rov shnayim b'behema. Why did the end teach the majority of the bird of one for a bird and the majority of two for an animal. Lafisha shaninu. It's because we were taught the following. Haviulo esatamid. This is a Mishnah in Yoma excuse me, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. So, and the Mishnah says the following: Heviu lo asatamin. It's talking about the Yom Kippur service, and you bring to the daily offering, the carbon tamid, to the Kohen Gadol. Karatso, he makes the cut. Umeirak acher shchitaso al yado, and another person finishes the slaughter. And Rashi explains to us. Karatso, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines up in the Rashi, in the narrow lines of Rashi towards the bottom of the dot. Karatso, mifarshinan hasam, we explain over there, beroshnayim, that the Kohen Gadol is going to cut the majority of the two pipes. Shelo haya yachol amaret veligmor es hashchita kulo, because the other person is not allowed to complete the shchita. Lefisha kol avodos Yom Kippurim einik sheira elabo, because all these services on Yom Kippur have to be performed by the Kohen Gadol. Diksiv b'achrei mot, because it says in Parshas Achrei Mot, v'chiper Kohen asher yimshach oto, that the Kohen who is anointed, namely the Kohen Gadol, v'hayat tzarich la'achos maher as hamizrak, and he needs to now quickly grab the bowl ulakabel hadam and receive the blood, because he has to do both jobs. Lefikach chotech bo kedei hechsher, so therefore he's going to cut enough to make a kosher slaughter, to do a kosher shchita, hechsher shchita, uminicha, and then he's going to leave it, umimaher lekabel, and then he'll quickly go to receive the blood. And so as a result, because he's got to do all the jobs, that's the reason for this action. Now we have not yet gotten Reish Lakish's explanation of how we know that therefore the end of our Mishnah is talking about a consecrated animal, but here we go. Yachol lo meirak yehe puzzle. Now I might have thought that if you didn't complete the sacrifice, that if the person who did not complete the slaughtering of the animal, you would result in an invalid sacrifice. Lekach shaninu. That's why our Mishnah needs to say rov echad ba'of, v'rov shnayim b'behema. That specifically when it comes even to sacrificial animals, a majority of one is kosher for a bird and a majority of two is kosher for a behema. So, 1 second, that doesn't really work, because Amar Mar Yachol lo Merik Ye Puzzle. You're going to tell me that maybe if the person didn't complete, the other person who's not the Kohen Gadol, the person who completes this sacrifice, if he didn't do his job, the sacrifice would be invalid? That can't possibly be, as we turn to Chav Tenem Abet. Im kain havulei avoda ba'acher. It would be a service on Yom Kippur by somebody else. V'tanya kol avodas Yom Kippur einik sheres elabo. The Kohen Gadol needs to do all the service on Yom Kippur. So how could you even have a hava amina of saying that the somebody else not finishing it would be a problem? So Haki Kamar. No, this is what Reish Lakish really means. Yachol yehe pasol midirabanan. You might have thought that it would be pasol rabbinically, and it won't be a problem of avodas ba'acher, because biblically the Kohen Gadol had finished his avoda. You might have said that there is a rabbinic prohibition here that if nobody finishes the job of the Kohen Gadol. L'kach shaninu. That's why our Mishnah says rov echad ba'of, rov shnayim b'behema. No matter what the situation, one more than a majority of one for a bird and a majority of two for a behema, even in the kachim situation, is going to be a valid sacrifice, and therefore that is why the Kohen Gadol, that actually, even though we have that Mishnah in Yoma that says that somebody else needs to complete the slaughter for him, it is not, in fact, although it's supposed to happen, it is not actually ma'akev. And if it doesn't happen, everything is still kosher. Well, ma'aker dafilu psula rabbanan leika lama li lamarik. Why bother teaching that Mishnah over there that somebody else needs to complete it? No, mitzvah lamarik. The point is that there is a positive commandment to complete the slaughter. It just doesn't invalidate the slaughter if you don't do it. As Rashi tells us at the top, Rashi on Kaf Tenem Bet, Mishum Dam, we need the person to complete the slaughter in order to get the blood out. Vani Shamati. Now I heard the Yoma that when it comes to Yoma, when it came to the Gemara in Yoma, Mishum Berov Am Hadras Melech, that really what this is about is the fact that we want more people to be involved in the worship of Hashem, and that when more people are involved, it praises Hashem, it's greater kavod for the king, and so that's why we want more people involved. The Ein Libi Lekach. But I don't think that's the case. To Im Kain, Kol Avodas Nami. Every avoda should be the same way. V'hari Katuv, Hikbid B'Kohen Gadol, the Geresh as Rov Am. But yet the Torah tells us everything has to be done by the Kohen Gadol and forget about everybody else. So as a result, that Rashi thinks it's really about the blood. It's not about having Rov Am Hadras Melech. Although it's worth noting that when it comes to some things that we do in shul, we actually do them in a Rov Am Hadras Melech method. For example, if you are a gabbai and people get called up for Hagba and Galila, it is actually part of the process for the gabbai to hand the gartel and the cover to the golel, to the person who's doing Galila, in order to participate in the process of Hagba and Galila, and thereby have this concept of Rov Am Hadras Melech. Okay. In
So
any
does the Kohen? So I'm confused here. So are we saying that someone other than the Kohen should complete it, even though the Kohen is bedercha? We think he's mechuyav to complete the shchita.
No. He will have completed the technical shchita, but somebody else will now cut more so that the blood will come out better, so that he will be able to catch the blood. Because now, once he's done the shchita, he now has to move to the job of catcher, of blood catcher. And so as a result, it's very hard to be the one who both does shchita and does the catching. And so as a result, he'll cut enough, and then he'll give the knife or have somebody else take a different knife and do the rest of the shchita, and he'll now move quickly, grab the bowl, and start catching the blood.
But isn't he himself involved in doing the what do you call it, the avodah and Yom Kippur? Isn't that his job?
Yeah, he has to do every aspect of the avodah. That's why he has to switch to being the catcher of the blood. Catching the blood is an avodah. And so, even though we're treating the slaughtering as an avodah, the bottom line, and he does do it. The point is that the furthering of the cuts to allow more blood to flow is not part of the avodah, and therefore can be done by somebody else.
So he brings someone else into the ohel, to the.
No. This is shchita. This is done in the courtyard. Shchita is always done in the courtyard. Nobody's shechting an animal in the Kodesh HaKodeshim.
Right. I know that.
Okay. So now the Gemara records a debate regarding what is considered the moment of shchita. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish b'shum Levi Saba. So Rabbi Reish Lakish says in the name of Levi Saba, Eina l'shchita ela b'sof. The moment of shchita is when the shchita is complete. The Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'atzov. No, the shchita is a shchita from the very beginning of when you started until when you finished. So Amar Rava hakol modim heichem deshachat siman echad va'oved kochavim v'siman echad Yisrael. When everybody agrees that when it comes to a situation where an idolater cuts one pipe and then a Jew cuts another pipe, shehi psula, that is considered invalid. Meaning, even if you're focusing on just the last minute, according to Reish Lakish, if you have somebody else who's not kosher do the first half, that's not going to be a valid shchita. Sharei nasa bo ba'maisa treifa, because the animal has been turned into a treifa by the first person, biyad ovi kochavim, through the actions of the idolater. But olas ha'of nami. And similarly, when it comes to olas ha'of, where you have to shech both pipes, hecha demalek siman echad lamata, the siman echad lamala. If now this is referring to the where you do the malika. and you're supposed to do the malika of an ola on above the midline of the mizbeach, and here you did part of the malika below and part of the malika above. Psula. Everybody agrees that that's going to be invalid because shaharei asa b'maisa chatas ha'of, because the chatas ha'of, which is does get the one pipe below, you did the action as if it was a chatas ha'of, and therefore it's a real action. It was the wrong action because you're trying to do olas ha'of and elamata, and so as a result, that's not the right place for malika of the old bird ola. You've done too much. It's going to be invalid according to everybody. Lo nechlaku elakagon. Here's where Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan disagree. Lo nechlaku elakagon shishachat simen echad b'chutz. Where you did shchita, where you moved the animal. The animal was just outside the courtyard, and you did the beginning of the first shchita outside the courtyard. The simen echad b'fnim, and then you did the second simen inside the courtyard. And we're talking about a large animal. So you need to do both of them. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the shchita is from the very beginning until the end, mechayev. Well, then you have done some aspect of shchita outside the azara. You are liable, as Rashi tells us, mechayev. Top line. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Chav Tenem Abed. Mechayev mishum shchutei chutz. You are liable for having slaughtered this animal partially outside the Beis Hamikdash. So Laman da Amr Eino l'shchita ela b'sof, and according to the opinion that says no, the shchita only happens at the end. Lo mechayev, you're not liable because the shchita wasn't complete until you were back inside the courtyard and everything is fine. So Amarle Rabbis
This is only for Kadshi Mill, right?
Yeah, that's what we're talking
right.
about.
Okay.
That is the application that we're trying to apply the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan to. So Amarle Rabba Barshimi. Rabba Barshimi says the following. Marlo Amar Kaki. My teacher did not teach it that way. Umanu, and who was that master? Rav Yosef. It was Rav Yosef. So rather, what did he teach? You know what? If you shecht one pipe outside and one pipe inside, you're also going to be liable for doing slaughtering outside the Beis Hamikdash. Sharei asa b'maiseh chatas ha'of, because one pipe is enough for slaughtering a bird chatas. So your action bachutz, and so as a result, that action is sufficient. And so as a result, there is no machlokas there either. Lo nechlaku elakagon sheshachas miyutzamanim b'chutz, where you only slaughtered a minority part of one of the pipes outside the Beis Hamikdash. Ugmaro bifnim, and then you slaughtered the majority, finished the slaughtering inside. So Lamanda Amar Yeshna L'Shchita Mitchilavat Sof, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you're from the beginning until the end, Mechayev, well then you're liable because you began the Shchita outside the Azara. Lamanda Amar Eina L'Shchita Elabasof, but according to Reish Lakish citing Levi Saba, so then you're not going Lo Mechayev, you're not going to be liable because Shchita only happens at the very last moment. So Masiv Rebbe Zera. So Rebbe Zera is going to ask a question. Kol ha'asukim b'para. Okay, so this question is going to take some time to develop. So let's be patient.
But weren't we talking about an animal? But when he shechted, he cut one pipe outside and then he brought it in. And Rashi b'shchutei chutz. Now we're talking about bird.
Well, the point is because this is the way I'm understanding the Gemara. It's a little complicated because it's not completely clear whether this is only true for a bird, but I think it's going to be true generally. The idea is the following. If you shecht one full pipe outside the Beis Hamikdash, whether for a bird or for an animal, because one pipe is sufficient for a bird chatas, your action is considered an action of shchita, and therefore your action is considered, and you did it outside the Azara, therefore you're liable for shchutei shchutz. You're for slaughtering a kodesh animal outside the Beis Hamikdash. That's the bottom line. And so that's the application that we're talking about. And so now, where is the machlokas? It's where you slaughter just a minority of the of the
So, but
of
what
the
about but
of
what
one of
about
the
if it's a
pipes.
behema, and he shecht it and he just cut one pipe outside and brought it in? He didn't do
Yeah, that would
shechita.
also, according to the way I'm understanding Gemara, that would also be a problem of your shechita is not kosher
Right,
because you didn't shech two pipes, but the
right.
action you did was an action that it constitutes a sufficient action in the base of Mikdash in certain circumstances to be the preparation of a sacrifice. Therefore, you have done an avoda outside the base of Mikdash. Therefore, you are liable. That's the way I'm understanding it based, and I think that's the simplest way to understand it. So, Masiv Rabbi Zera. So, Rabbi Zera says, I've got the following problem because with your entire explanation of this machlokus, because of the following. Kol ha'asukim with and specifically I've got a problem with Rabbi Yochanan's position that shechita is from the beginning to the end. Because kol asukim b'para. We have the following Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Para, Mishnah Dalid in Perek Dalid. So, what does it say? It says everybody who's involved in the Para, mitchila v'atso, from the beginning until the end. Mitamin begadim. They all of their clothing becomes tamei, meaning they become tamei and their clothing becomes tamei. Uposlin osab malach acheres. And if while they're doing any of the work on the para aduma, they do some other work at the same time that's not for the para aduma, the entire para aduma becomes invalid. Ereba pasal b'shchita. Now that was statement number one. Now statement number two in this brisa. It's going to, we need all three statements, and then we're going to understand, and then we're going to ask the question. So be patient. So now, when the para aduma is being slaughtered, it is some kind of invalidity happened during the course of the shechita. Bain kodem psula, bain la'achar psula, whether now the people who were working on that Korban Pesach, it doesn't make a difference whether they worked on the Korban Pesach before the psul happened in the Shechita or after the psul happened in the Shechita. All of their actions are irrelevant because the animal was not a kosher animal. Eina mitame begadim. Their clothing does not become tamei. Rashi tells us 1, 2, 3, 4,
Why are you
5,
talking
6,
about
7,
Korban Pesach?
8,
Isn't
9,
this the
10.
paraduma?
I said paraduma. Did I say Korban Pesach?
You said Korban Pesach.
My apologies. We're talking about the paraduma. If I said Korban Pesach, that was a total speako. My apologies. Paraduma. So their clothing becomes does not become tamei. And Rashi again 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 11 lines up. Ein mitame begadim. She'ein kan avoda. There is no service here because the shechita was invalid. This is not a paraduma. Vim asaf afra. And so as a result, if you gathered the ashes, osreifa, or you engaged in the burning, below nagaba, and you didn't actually touch the dead animal because now the dead animal is a nevela, and so as a result, you could become tummy that way. But if you didn't do that, or afilu nagaba, or you touched the dead animal, bipshute kliates, with a straight piece of wood, meaning a piece of wood that is not a kli, lo tamaso, you're not going to be tame, mishum nevela, as a result of the animal being a nevela. Eino tame mishum misasek b'para. You're not going to be tame because you were involved in the paraduma, even though if you ordinarily with a kosher paraduma, you would have become tame. She'ain kan paraduma, because this is not considered a paraduma. So that is case number 2 in our brisa. Case number 3, v'hazasa. What if during the sprinkling? Now, this sprinkling is not the sprinkling of the para aduma water on somebody who is tahor, but rather, bahazasa, next Rashi, bahazas dama, when you're doing the sprinkling of the blood of the para aduma, shahaya maza hemena sheva pamim, because you would sprinkle 7 times, keneged pesach shel heichal. Even though you were doing this well outside the Beis Hamikdash, you would face the opening of the heichal, and you would sprinkle towards that opening 7 times. It would obviously, blood wouldn't obviously reach the heichal. You're very far away. You're a mountain away. So, but in any event, you would sprinkle in that direction. Kidiksiv, as it says in Perek Yotet, I think it's Pasuk Dalit, V'hizah el nochach penei oel moed. You sprinkle towards the opposite the opening of the Ohel Moed. So that's when the psul happened. And now what happened in that situation when the psul happened in the sprinkling of the blood? Kodem psula. If you were involved in the para aduma before that sprinkling and became improper and it became a problematic animal, and therefore the para aduma became puzzle. Mitama, you become tameh because until then it was a valid para aduma. Mitama begodim. Your clothing would become tameh, and you would become tameh. La'achar psula ain't a mitama begodim. But after, if you were involved in it only afterwards, well, now it's no longer a para aduma, and so your clothing would not become tameh. Now, those are the only cases that Mishnah talks about. And now we're ready for our question. Okay, and that is where we're up to. So okay, so hold on. So the amrat yeshna lashchita mitchila vatso. But now, according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, who says that there is the concept of shchita from the beginning until the end, liflog nami b'shchita sa. We should categorize even the situation within the shchita. Why don't we say that if the beginning of the shchita was valid, so the beginning of the shchita is a valid shchita, and only later at the end, when he makes the mistake of going too far in this direction or too far in that direction, or waiting or doing any of the things that cause a mistake, only then does it no longer become a carbon a paraduma, excuse me. And so as a result, we should distinguish between when the psul happens within the process of the shchita, and the Mishnah doesn't do that. So doesn't that show that Rabbi Yochanan is wrong? So Amarava, no, it doesn't show that Rabbi Yochanan is wrong. Niskalkala shchita kameris. We're dealing with a ruined shchita. So shiny hasam, that case is different. De ugle milsalim afreya de lav shchita hiklal. Yes, the shchita process is referring to the entire time that you're cutting, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, but that is not. But it only all is a shchita if the whole thing works. If at the end of the day you didn't do a kosher shchita, none of it is considered shchita. And so that is how even Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with this Mishnah in Para. Now, Amarava, ikashali, hakashali. I'll tell you the real question that you should be asking based on that Mishnah over there in Para. Lamanda Amar Ein Lishchita Ela B'Vasov. I'm going to ask it not on Rabbi Yochanan. I'm going to ask it on Reish Lakish. According to Reish Lakish, that the shchita only happens at the end. Liflog b'hechshara depara kagon dishachtua betray Gabri de Gabra kama lo mitama v'Gabra basa mitama. I'll tell you the following. Let's imagine that you have two people doing the shchita of this paraduma, and you have the person one do it, and then person two do it. Well, if in fact the problem happens in if the problem happens when the second person does you know what? Let's pause here. I'm realizing I'm not fully understanding this question the way I thought I understood it. So let me pause here, and we will pick up with Amar Rava God willing, tomorrow. So I realize that the question is not 100% clear to me. So we're going to pick up from Amar Rava, Ikashali, Hakashali, God willing, tomorrow. My apologies for starting and then stopping. So we'll pick up from again with Rava's understanding of the question, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
What was the machloket? Did we?
So the
What?
machlokas is again. There's the machlokas that we're so to give you set us up. The machlokas is between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish in the name of Reish Lakish in the name of Lady Saba says that shechita is only the moment at the end of the shechita when the shechita is complete. Rabbi Yochanan says no, the shechita is referring to the entire time that you're cutting, from the very beginning until the end. And the debate is when you have an animal that is partially sacrificed, a minority of one pipe is sacrificed outside the Beis Hamikdash and then brought inside the Beis Hamikdash to finish the shechita. According to Reish Lakish, that's a situation because you focus just on the end. That don't worry about it. It's all you haven't done. Shita outside the Beis Hamikdash. You haven't done an avoda outside the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore you're not liable for having done an avoda outside the Beis Hamikdash. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you began the avoda outside the Beis Hamikdash. You've done some avoda outside the Beis Hamikdash. That's going to be a problem. So that's the machlokas that we have. And now what we're trying to do is bring other cases to see. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan's right. Maybe Reish Lakish is right. And so we brought a number of cases. Rava responded to Rabbi Zera's question, and then he offers his own question, and that's where we're going to begin with, God willing, tomorrow. So stay tuned for tomorrow's daf, and we will start with Rava's question.
There are other situations, I can't name them now, where there's a machlokas whether something is the beginning or the end, or what do we consider? There are many other situations. And I don't know. I don't recall if there's a general rule whether we hold an action is from the beginning or the end, or.
Well, I think that each of these situations are distinct. Meaning, shechita here is going to be. I mean, just like for example, we had the question of rove. We didn't have time to do the Tosos, but Tosos notes that when it comes to Eruvin, it's clear that 50% is considered like the whole thing. And we don't bring any of the proofs from Eruvin over here. So Tosos notes that, in fact, Shechita and Eruvin are clearly different, and we don't have the same concept in the two. So there, to the extent that we might have the similar machlokot elsewhere, I don't think that necessarily means that we are we can learn one from the other. Shechita is sufficiently unique that sometimes at least in many circumstances it will not be something that we can learn to something else. So, but you're absolutely right that the concept of whether the beginning of something, when we have something that takes some amount of time, the question of when is the relevant moment, when is the actual moment of action, is a relevant question in other contexts as well. And so we'll, like I said, we'll pause here, and God willing, Rava's question will be asked again tomorrow. Wishing everybody a good Shabbos.